For this month's project, we've got a casual table. Now, it could of course be used interior. This particular one is destined for the outside. I've constructed it out of cedar. I've sealed it with a water sealer stain product that's for exterior applications, decks and fences and so forth. And I've done something rather unique with the top. And that was to help it tolerate the rain and the snow and so forth. So I'll bring you in a little closer, show you that detail before we jump into construction. As you can see, the top is made up of marble floor tiles that are 12 inches square, and they're backed up by 3/4 inch thick exterior grade plywood. Now, there's two things going on here as to why I went with this technique. One, if you're sitting at the table, you can see through these gaps down to the floor, and that creates a very interesting visual effect. You almost seem like these marble tiles are just floating in this space. Secondary to that is a functional aspect of it. When it rains or during the snowy season and snow piles up on here, as it melts or as the rain comes down, it can go straight through the top down to the ground. It won't sit on the top and create problems like it would on a solid wood top for an exterior use table. So it's very functional and it's very aesthetic. So let's dive right in and start on the construction. I'm getting started on this project by first making a template of the feet area of the legs. Now it has these curves both on the inside edge and on the top edge of that foot area. Now I do need to make a bow, which is nothing more than a strip of wood, rather thin, clamped in a large bar clamp. That allows me to compress it, creating a curve that I want. Now I've got to have a couple of control points. For this inside curve, I just need 3 control points, where the center is and the height, and then where it terminates at the 2 end points. For the upper curve, there's actually going to be, so to speak, 4 control points that we need to create a curve around. There will be the 2 end points, and then there's a flat area where we'll be cutting in a dado, so to speak. Now, at the ends of that flat area is our 2 other control points. So we'll have 2 here and 2 out here. Now all I need to do is just bring my bar clamp with my bow on it into position, and then I'll tighten up the clamp until the curvature lines up with those 4 control points. Once I get that curvature just right, I'll slide it back, pencil in my line for the bottom curve, and then we can start doing our layout for our cutting. Now sometimes it's necessary to shift your bow back and forth to find the natural center of that curvature. So that's what I'm doing, just shifting it back and forth until I get those 4 points to line up with a good curve. Now I'll just pencil that in, and then we can cut out our template. Then I'll slide the bow back, add a little bit more tension to it, and we'll line up those 3 points and pencil in that mark. I'm using cedar, the type of cedar that's used for making decks. It's a good outdoor wood, and in our climate it holds up very well. Now, the material that I've bought is actually for decking. The boards that I've got are what are called 2x6s. They measure up roughly at 1.5 inches by 5.5 inches wide. Now, what I want to do is go through and lay out on my boards where each of the components come from. And that's where this template really comes in handy. It helps to maximize the yield out of a given piece of wood. So I'll just play with my paper templates and get my layouts. Using my compound miter saw, I can go ahead and start cutting out some of the components. The rest of them I'll have to do over at the bandsaw, of course. Now over here at the bandsaw, I've got a 1/2 inch blade. What I'm going to do is just cut along the top portion of the curve, leaving the line so I can clean that up later. But I don't want to cut that inside curve just yet. And then that area where we have the flat spot along the top edge, I'll leave plenty of stock there because we want to square that up and true that up over at the table saw. The leg area is actually going to be 3 inches wide when it's done, so I couldn't get 3-inch wide stock, so I'm going to laminate together 2 pieces. That's why I have 4 leg bottoms. Now, on this next step, what we need to do is qualify that 4 5/16 inch dimension. That'll create our flat area on the top area of the curve. That's why I didn't want you to cut out that curve just yet, because now all we have to do is just pass this over the table saw to qualify that length. And back at the bandsaw, we can go ahead and cut along our line to create the inside curve. onto our legs now, we need them to be rather large. This will add a lot of stability to the table, but buying stock of this size can be challenging. We want it 3 inches thick and approximately 11 inches wide. Now to 2 pieces of 2 by 6, it's almost 11 inches wide, so we're okay. And then adding 2 thicknesses, laminating them together, that will give us our 3-inch thickness. Big massive legs for our casual table. Now what we need to do is edge glue these together like so. Now I do want to somewhat conceal that rounded over edge that the mill put on there, so I'm going to pass them over my jointer to remove that edge, and it will also create a nice gluing surface. So what we'll start out with on our legs is getting all these pieces edge glued together. Now I'm going through and wetting one edge of one board. I'm using a polyurethane glue, which is moisture cured. Now it is a very humid day today, so this will probably activate without the need for adding that water, but I'd rather not take a chance. Now I'm using polyurethane glue because this is an outdoor project. This will be subjected to everything from temperature swings of 10 degrees up to as much as 100 degrees, snow, rain, you name it, we've got it here in the Midwest. Now you'll notice I'm working with rubber gloves. This stuff will adhere to anything, including skin, so working with the gloves kind of keeps my hands looking good. Now on the ends I've gone through and marked them for orientation so I get good looking faces where I want them. And while I'm doing some glue up work, I might as well get my 2 foot halves laminated together too. Now I'm just aligning the ends, making sure they're sitting flat on my workbench, and that way I'll have a flat bottom here, and all my tops will still be qualified. And then we'll just clamp it up with as many clamps as we can get on there. After the glue dried up on our leg blanks, I ran them through the planer to flatten them out and to smooth up the faces. Now what we need to do is create our joint, which is going to be a bridle joint where the leg meets up with the foot area. Now of course, when it's assembled like so, it will actually look like a groove through this area. But that would be very hard to machine after it's assembled. So while we got it apart, now's a good time to do it. So we're going to actually do a bridle joint like 2 rabbet joints. We'll start out by making a shoulder cut, then we'll mount it up in our shop-made tenon jig, and then pass it over the saw blade again, removing our waste material. Now the setup for this is actually quite simple. All I need to do on this setup is just have my standard saw blade raised up to 3/4 of an inch, and I've attached a stop block. The distance from this surface to this side of my blade is 3 inches and 1/16. And of course my miter gauge is square to the blade and the blade is square to the table. Now all we need to do is pass our board over with our face down where we want that rabbet to be. Now to start on the cheek cuts, I'll raise up my blade to 3 1/16 high. At this point I've got my leg in my shop-made tenoning jig, got the saw blade raised up, and now I'm bringing the fence in until I zero out my saw blades. The saw blade right now is just touching this surface. So that's my reference point. Now I know I need to move my stock 3/4 of an inch over to complete this cut, but this gives me my starting point. And of course the saw is unplugged anytime you're touching the saw blade. Our 2 leg stretchers are going to join up with our legs in 2 slots like so. Now before I laminate the 2 leg halves together, now's a good time to go through and cut out these square openings. I've already laid them out, and I'll use the bandsaw to cut up close to the line, but I'm going to leave the line and fit the joints after I get the leg stretchers machined up. So I'll have to do some filing and so forth to get that to fit up nice. And now for a little bit of handwork. I'll start out first by squaring up the bottoms. As you can see, I've made a series of kerf cuts to make this operation go much easier. And we'll work in halfway from each side to finish it up. At this point, all I'm trying to do is flatten up these surfaces a little bit. I'll go for final fit when I have the mating component. Now our next step is to cut the hourglass shape. Now we want to do both halves together so that they line up nicely. We can't assemble them at this point because we're going to have somewhat of a dovetail configuration down here where it joins up in the foot area. So we need to fit this to the leg or the foot area before we can assemble it. So I'm going to apply some double-faced tape and then bring the two halves together. And this will give us a temporary bond so that we can cut that outline on the part and then get it back apart again for final assembly. When I drew up my template, I made a centerline mark. And that makes it very easy to line up with our stock material because we've got the glue line that's in the center of it. Now we'll just trace the pattern and cut it out on the bandsaw. Now we need to turn our attention to joining our legs with the foot area. And when I designed this leg, I wanted this outside or the vertical portion to continue all the way down to the bottom of our arched foot area. It just looks more attractive. Traditionally you'd see this vertical component mortise and tenon joined into the foot area. And of course, once you see that enough times, it becomes pretty common. So to wrap the leg around the outside requires a lot more work, but it creates a very attractive element with this vertical grain here and then the horizontal grain here. Doing the procedure is actually quite primitive, but we'll show you those steps. First, take your foot area and create a center line that goes all the way around it. This is very important. You want to get this layout just right, because this will help us align both the front and back halves of the leg. So now we've got our center line. Now I'll take one of the leg halves and I'm going to line the glue line along the center line of the leg half with my center line mark that's on the foot area. I'll line that up very careful and clamp the two pieces together. Now using a nice fine pencil, I'll transfer the outline of the leg onto the foot. Now this is the area that we need to remove, approximately 3/4 of an inch deep. Now we want these ends, these cut marks right here, to be as crisp as we can make them because they will be visible. So I'm going to use a guide block and a simple handsaw to make that initial cut. I'll just clamp that guide block right over my line, completely covering it, and just using an ordinary back saw, we'll start that cut. Now those of you that follow David's column, you'll recognize this as a stop cut. Now here you can see my two stop cuts, and what we need to do is remove this material. Now really about the quickest way to do that is with a handheld router. In my router I've got a 1-inch diameter carbide tipped router bit. It's a white side router bit, and I've got my depth set appropriately. Now I'm just going to very carefully work my way through this area. I'll plow through once and then just zigzag back and forth, removing the material in one direction. Now if you didn't let the router run away from you, at this point your legs should not fit. Got a little more shaving off to do over on this side, and then we'll be able to drop our leg down. Now to shape up these sides, I'm going to use a combination of both chisels and a coarse file. Now I'll get started by cleaning out this area where the router bit didn't get. Now I'll take a couple of paring cuts where needed. Good sharp chisels are really important with this cedar. It is not the best wood in the world for shaping. And now a little bit of cleanup work with a coarse file. And we check it for fit again. And we've got it. Now we're ready to move on to the opposite side. Now we flip everything over, take the opposite leg half, lay that on top of our assembly, bring it down so our rabbet lines up with the top of the foot area. And then we'll use a square against our workbench to line up both halves of our leg. And then when we have them lined up nice, pencil in our layout mark and repeat the process. Now we can assemble our legs to their feet area. Again, polyurethane glue, so I'm wetting the surfaces. Now I'm going to have to laminate these two pieces together, the front and back halves of the legs, so I am going to be using quite a bit of glue. I'll probably get it all over my hands, so we will protect them with vinyl gloves. Nothing fancy for an applicator, just a cut off piece of wood. And now we can clamp it up and let the glue set. You just saw me cut off our leg stretchers to their overall length of 44 inches. The width and thickness are stock dimensions. 1.5 inches thick, 5.5 inches wide based on the 2x6 dimensions. Now this will be joined into the two legs using somewhat of a mortise and tenon joint. Now what we need to do, of course, is cut the tenons on the ends. So we'll start out by making those shoulder cuts. I'll be using my miter gauge here at the table saw for that. And what I want to do is set up a stop block 1.5 inches from the end to create the overall length for our tenon. Now I've already gone through and passed my miter gauge over the saw blade to give me my kerf cut. That gives me a reference point. And I'll affix a stop block 1.5 inches from that point and clamp it in place. Now the next adjustment will be to make sure that the saw blade height is correct so that we don't end up cutting too deep. For the cuts that will actually be going on the face, we want them 1/4 inch deep, and I'm about a 64 shy, so I'll raise the blade a little bit more and take another test cut. Now I'll raise the saw blade to 1/2 inch to make our shoulder cuts on the edges of the board. Now I'm getting ready to finish up the tenon by making the cheek cut. What I'm doing is adjusting my fence over with my shop-made tenoning jig until I just touch the saw blade, and I think I'm right there now. That'll be my reference point. I know I need to take 1/4 inch off, so now all I have to do is adjust my fence over 1/4 inch. Well, 1 inch is what we wanted, and 1 inch is exactly what we've got, within 1/1000th of an inch. I'd say that's perfect. Now we need to cut away the rest of this waste material, so I'll set my dial caliper at 1/2 inch, then using a small drafting triangle, I'll line it up off the edge of the board and pencil in the layout mark. Now I can go over to the bandsaw and cut away the waste material. As you can see, here's my bow again to create that curve or layout for the curve at the bottom of our leg stretcher. And I've also taken the time to lay out the 3 dados that we'll be adding in later. Now I can go over to the bandsaw and cut away that waste. Now I'm using a 3/4 inch stacked dado head cutter for that. I've got it raised up 1.5 inches. Now it is only 3/4 inch wide, so I'll have to take this in a couple passes. To guide the stock over the dado cutter, I'm using my miter gauge with a large auxiliary fence that helps to stabilize the work. To minimize the amount of work I have to do, I've clamped both pieces together after very carefully lining them up, and I've done the layout on just one of the pieces. So now all I have to do is just carefully line up the part and then pass it over the dado cutter. Now, if you have a low horsepower saw, you may have to take this in several cuts, working your way up in height. This is a 3 horsepower machine, so it should be able to cut through this without any trouble. The tabletop stretchers will start out with standard 2x6 stock, and what we're going to do first is rip the boards in half. And then if they curl up on us a little bit, we can pass them over the joiner to true up the faces. As you can see, the one board was fine, but the two other ones opened up on me. They curled out a little bit. So I am going to pass this surface over the joiner to true it up, and then I'll flip it over with that trued up surface against the fence and rip them to their final width of 2.5 inches. Now what we're going to do is cut off each of the top stretchers to the proper overall length. Now I do want them to all be exactly the same length, and the best way to improve accuracy at this operation is to affix a stop block so that you can bump up each of your workpieces to that point and cut them off all to the same length. That cut just gave me both a shoulder and a cheek cut all in one operation. It's just another way of machining a tenon on the end of a board. Now the setup is very easy. It's just like setting up for your shoulder cuts. Except in this case, we're using a 3/4 inch stacked dado head cutter. You'll notice I've got it in a 0 clearance insert plate. I've got my stop block on my miter gauge just as I did before. I raised up the stacked dado head cutter, in this case to 1/8 of an inch, and then as you saw, it's just a matter of passing the board over a couple of times. And of course, anytime you're doing this type of operation where you're making shoulder cuts or combination of shoulder cheek cut, make sure that your miter gauge is in fact square to your blade. Our next step on the joinery machining is to machine a groove on the end of our tenon. Now we need it to be 1/2 inch down from the top and 7/8 of an inch wide. I don't have a 7/8 inch wide stacked dado head cutter, so I'll have to take it in 2 setups. What I've got now is my stacked dado head cutters in there from the previous operation, and it's 3/4 of an inch wide. And I've got my rip fence adjusted over so that it's flush with the side of the dado blade right now. Over at the back side of my fence, I've got a dial indicator set up. Now what I need to do is move back a 1/2 inch or 500 thousandths of an inch. And that gives me exactly a 1/2 of an inch. Then I've carefully raised the stacked dado head cutter up so that it's at 1 inch in height, and we're ready to make our first cut to create that groove. Right now our groove is 3/4 of an inch wide, 750 thousandths, and we wanted it 7/8 of an inch, which is 875 thousandths. So I need to move over another 1/8 of an inch on my rip fence to get this slot wider. Back at the fence with my dial indicator, I'll move it over 1/8 of an inch or 125 thousandths and lock it down. Now I'm ready to take my next cut. Now, do you need a dial indicator? Absolutely not. Does it make it more accurate? Well, that depends. If you can read your scales very well and your eyes are in good shape, perhaps you don't need an indicator. My eyes aren't the best, so I like to use the dial indicator. Using the same setup I did for the leg stretchers, our top stretchers need this same type of dado. Except in this case, it's only 1 inch high, so I've lowered my stacked dado head cutter, but it's still a 3/4 inch. I'm still using my miter gauge. And this time I've clamped together 3 of the top stretchers. Only 3 of them get these 2 notches in them. Now again, you just line it up and take the cuts. Once again, I'm using a bow to create a curve on the bottom of our top stretchers. I'll cut one very accurately and then trace that shape onto the remaining 5. Here you can see the dry assembled top frame in its current state. We've got our 2 leg stretchers and then our 5 top stretchers. Now what we need to do is focus on our perimeter frame. Now there will be 2 side pieces, 2 end pieces. They'll be joined at the corners with miter joints, and we'll reinforce that with a biscuit. Now we also, on these side pieces, need to cut a series of mortises to accept the top stretchers. And that will really unify that whole structure. So now what we'll do is we'll start ripping up that stock and get ready to make the perimeter frame, and then we can bring it all together in one big assembly. I'll get started here at the table saw by ripping the stock to width, and then we'll go over to the miter saw and cut our miter joints. What I'm doing now is marking the location centrally, top to bottom, on our perimeter frame here at the miter joint. We're going to be reinforcing this joint with the number 0 biscuit, and I want to keep that biscuit as close to the inside edge of that miter joint as I can, because we will be rounding over this outside edge. And that's all there is to that. I'll repeat that on the remaining miters. Now, to have a way to join our top stretchers to the side rails, we need to machine a mortise. I'm using, of course, my hollow chisel mortiser. I've got a 1/2 inch bit in there, and I've set it 7/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge of our rail. Now, the way this will fit on here is like so. Once we machine that mortise, so that's where our 7/8 inch dimension comes from, and this is a 1/2 inch. And we'll set the depth of our mortise hole to the length of our tenon. And that's how it should fit in there, nice and snug, but not so you have to hammer it in. We've got it fitting in good, fits up good at the bottom, our gap is right. Now we're ready to machine the remaining mortises. Well, the dry assembly went real well. There's a lot of pieces, but the nice thing about that polyurethane glue is it sets up nice and slow, so that'll give me time to get all the pieces lined up where they need to be. And as we have been doing, we'll wet the surfaces first with just regular water. Then we'll go through and apply some glue on each of the surfaces. You'll notice that I've put down protective paper. As you know, this is my outfeed table of the table saw, and having globs of glue on there is probably not a real good idea. I'll use a small brush, get that glue spread around real nice. Now I'll get my top stretchers in along one rail, and now we bring in the other side rail. This one I won't put on all the way just yet. I'll get it on most of the way. And this is why we don't want to bring that other side rail in all the way yet. If we bring in the 2 side rails all the way tight against the top stretchers, we won't be able to get the end pieces in with the biscuits. And now we can start clamping it together, drawing all the joints together good and tight. With these miter joints, a band clamp is working out very, very well. I do want to make sure that this is good and square, so I'm going to measure across the diagonals, 75.5, and 75 3/8. I'm a 1/16 inch out of square. Now that will really show up bad when we get the tiles put in the center area, because those should be nice and square. So I'm just going to try and bump it around a little bit and see if I can't get it to go square. And I think we've got it. 75 7/16, 75 and 7/16. Now I probably will put a couple more clamps on this way to draw these top stretchers in tight against the mortises, but other than that, we're in good shape. Before final assembly, now's a good time to go through and round over all the edges to make them nice and soft. I'm using a 1/4 inch radius round over bit in my handheld router, and I'll just pass it around all the areas where I can gain access to. I've got all my surfaces finished sanded. Now we can go for final assembly, and that'll consist of the 2 leg assemblies, the 2 leg stretchers, and then eventually, once we get that pretty well together and stabilized, we'll bring together the top frame as well. But first, let's get our 2 legs and our 2 stretchers joined together. Now, of course, make sure you go through a dry assembly first. and a couple of bar clamps to help hold everything together for a few minutes until the glue takes hold. And then we can move this out of the way, put our frame top there, and then bring the two pieces together. Well, it's been about an hour. The glue's starting to grab hold nice. So now we can bring the two components together. Again, polyurethane glue as we've been using all along. Now during the dry assembly, you probably noticed that these two end top stretchers push against the outside of the legs. So we're going to take advantage of that and glue the outside edge of the legs against that surface. That will greatly unify this entire structure. Now what we'll do is we'll transfer these two clamps to the outside of those two tabletop stretchers to draw everything tight in that direction. Then I'll add a couple clamps vertically to help hold our stretchers this way against our leg stretchers. For my top, I'm using a marble tile. You could also use the ceramic tiles. There's many beautiful choices available today. Now these are roughly 12-inch by 12-inch square tiles. It's roughly 5/16 of an inch thick. The top surface is polished, so it's rather shiny. Bottom surface is rather dull. But its thickness, that 5/16 of an inch thickness, can be a bit of a problem because there's really not any strength to this piece. Be it ceramic or marble. It's actually quite fragile, very brittle. So what we want to do is back it up with something that is a little bit more malleable and has more strength. This particular table is going outside, so I want an exterior grade product to back up that tile. So I'm using 3/4 inch thick exterior grade plywood. Now that'll give us a lot of strength to it. It won't be like a floor because the edges won't be supported. The tiles themselves will be balanced on that beam, so you wouldn't want to walk on this table, but it should give a very beautiful visual effect. Now I don't want to see the plywood edges, so I'm actually going to make my plywood pads almost a full inch smaller than the size of the tiles. So roughly, if it's a 12-inch square tile, I'm going to go with an 11-inch square plywood sub-base for it. So we'll rip that out of this 3/4 inch exterior grade plywood, and then we can start attaching it to the table frame. Installing the plywood backer panels is going to be somewhat similar to installing a ceramic tile floor. Now what we're going to be doing is we're going to first get the center row in. I've already measured my distance between here and here so I could center up these plywood pieces, and I made marks all along here so I can get them centered. I've also got a shim that I cut up so that I can get my spacing about right and to keep all these plywood panels square to the framing. Now for adhesive, we're going to be using a construction adhesive for this. What we're going to use is a Liquid Nails product. They call it Subfloor and Deck. It's designed for attaching decking boards to the framing members for exterior applications, so it should work out very well for us here. I believe this is going to be very tacky, so we probably won't even need clamps, but you may want to throw a clamp on there if you have some plywood that's a little bit warped and twisted. You will want to put your best face up, the smoothest face, the one with the least amount of void, so that'll give you the best gluing surface to attach our marble tile. Now with the center row in, now we can put in the outside edges. Again, we'll center it up this way and follow our spacing on these tiles going in this direction. And as you can see, this is only supported by that center piece, so you don't want to have any table dances on this table when it's finished. And we'll just put a couple of battens, long boards running this way, and then a few crossways, and we'll clamp everything down, and that'll hold all these individual plywood pieces flat relative to each other. Now we'll let this glue set up for the recommended period of time, and then we can move on to a little bit more detailing and some finishing. The last step that I want to address before finishing is to do some detail work. on this inside edge here where it would butt up with our ceramic tiles, I'm rounding mine over with a 1/4 inch radius roundover bit. Just a small break on there, and then I sanded it lightly. On this outside edge, however, what I want to do is a larger radius there. It just makes it more comfortable when you're sitting at the table. So I'm going with a 1/2 inch radius roundover out here. You kind of pick what feels best for you and what looks best for you. I also took the sander and rounded over these outside corners so that they're not as sharp. Then I'll go through, sand these bottom corners a little bit so that they're not sharp as well. Now we're ready to move into the finishing stage. And it's going to require 2 different finishing products, primarily because I'm not sure of how one finishing product might affect another. Now, I've gone through and applied 2 coats of a very high quality exterior primer to the top surfaces of our plywood panels. Now, the reason why I've done that is the primer will work well with most adhesives. We'll be using a construction adhesive to attach the tiles to these plywood panels. Now, for the rest of the table, I'm using an exterior grade water seal stain product. You use it on decks and fencing and so forth. I'm using a cedar tone product or coloring, and it's an oil-based product, and you just simply brush it on, and that gives you good protection. If it holds up well on decks and fences, it should hold up well on a table. And I don't know how the adhesives will interact with that type of an oil-based finish. So that's why I went through and primed these surfaces with a regular exterior primer, and then I'll apply that water seal stain product onto the rest of the cedar components. And it's just a matter of brushing it on. I've had real good luck with these products with other home projects, fences and so forth. Now generally you just brush it on, working with the grain. I myself don't like film finishes for exterior applications like spar varnishes and so forth. Here in our Midwestern climate, they tend to fail rather quickly between perhaps it's our temperature and humidity extremes, because we can go from literally 0 degrees and 10% humidity in the winter months all the way up to 100 degrees and 90% humidity during the summer months. So we've got such extremes in this area. I myself have never gotten a good film finish to hold up well. That would be on fences, outdoor furniture, exterior doors, and so forth. So I've found that these oil-based sealer stain products that are designed for fences and decks and so forth hold up real well. And they look good and stay looking good for a very long period of time. And then when it's time to refinish them, it's not a big hassle to try and get off all that film that's breaking away and peeling off and so forth. Now I will be using this product on all of the surfaces, top, bottom, the bottoms of the feet area on the legs, everywhere where I can get it. I'm going to give it a couple of coats following the manufacturer's recommendations. So I'll be at this for a while, and we'll pick up with you after I get the staining operation done. And now we're ready for our last step, and that's to install our tile tops. Now I've selected a marble tile, approximately 5/16 of an inch thick. It's got a rough surface on the back, polished surface on the top. Now we're going to be using another construction adhesive. This one's specifically designed for marble and granite and solid surface materials, and it's interior-exterior, so it should work out very well. So we'll go through, apply some adhesive around our plywood surface, get it covered a little bit, set the tile in, twist it around a little bit as we set it to try and smoosh out the glue and get a good bond. I've ripped up some shims to go between the tiles. I'm not a real good tile setter, so I need a little bit of help. So I've got shims taped along the outside rails, so I can just slide the tile against that, and that will create nice even spacing. So I'll go around the perimeter first, and then I'll fill in the 3 center pieces, of course getting my spacing just right. Now you'll find that this adhesive is much thicker and harder to squeeze out than the other industrial adhesive we used earlier. Set the tile in there, trying to get it roughly in the place where we want it. Again, I've got a shim here and a shim here. Now push down on it, twist it a little bit. Then I'll slide it out against my shims. And that way we'll have nice even spacing. And I'll repeat this all the way around for all of our perimeter tiles. And just 3 more tiles to go. And make sure you press down firmly on the tiles. And for the last tile. And that wraps up this project. In our next issue, we'll address the seating arrangements for this fine casual table. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home. Thanks for watching.